And for all participants, if you may have any questions or inquiries, I'm delighted to let you know that Professor Sacco will be with us until the end of the program tomorrow morning. Well, to keep the ball rolling, let us proceed next with the second opening keynote remarks. For us who have been working in international higher education, it is a must to know, understand, and apply our keynote speaker's concept of world-class university. Our keynote speaker is a global tertiary education expert providing policies advice to governments, universities, professional associations, multilateral development banks, and bilateral cooperation agencies. Until January 2012, he was the World Bank's Tertiary Education Coordinator. In the past 25 years, he has provided advice on tertiary education development, financing reforms, and strategic planning to governments and university leaders in about 100 countries all over the world. So without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Jamil Salmi with his opening keynote remarks on internationalizing higher education toward world-class institutions. Please.
A very good morning to all of you. It's a great honor to be invited to participate in this conference. I'm not trying to be polite to you, but the truth is that your country has always been one of my favorites. Even though my first experience in 1976 was a bit challenging, I was at a student meeting at Thammasat University, which turned out to be quite violent, and that day I realized I could never be a guerrilla fighter. I was very much inspired by this morning's keynote, especially when Professor Sacco said that when you are up in space, you don't see the separations, the divisions among people. A few years back in South Africa at a conference, I had the pleasure of meeting one of your colleagues, the first Afro-American astronaut, Guion Bluford. And I remember he was asked by a little South African girl about his messages, and he said two things. First, you have to learn science and math and physics, because that's what takes you ahead in the world. And second, as you said yourself, Professor Sacco, that from up there you don't see frontiers. You don't see different religions or ethnic groups. You just see one planet. That's our home. And as I go around our planet, I've noticed something different in the past few years. All of a sudden, people seem to be obsessed with the notion of world class. So this is a world-class gym in Kazakhstan, if you want to be in good shape. Also for your shopping. Are you world-class when you do your shopping? If you still trust banks, are you going to a world-class bank? Even the water that we drink is supposed to be world-class, otherwise it's not right. And that reminds me of a Nigerian novel that I read many years ago by name Nonko. And it was called My Mercedes is Bigger Than Yours. And I believe that something similar is happening in higher education. Because when two university presidents or vice chancellors meet at an international conference like this over cocktails, they smile politely to each other, but I can imagine their mind racing, wondering, is your university more world-class than mine? What image do you have of my university? Very prestigious? Or maybe a little bit less prestigious? Or even less? Or maybe you think I'm a traditional university. Now seriously, when we think about universities, unlike a chemist or a biologist who can run an experiment in her or his lab without hurting anybody but themselves, we have to be very careful, because if we run experiments, we are talking about the lives of hundreds of academics and thousands of students. So I was very pleased when by pure accident I encountered a real-life experiment that looks like a lab experiment, and that is in your neighbor country, in Malaysia. As you remember, in the late 50s, when the first university was established, University of Malaya, 2 campuses were set up, one in Kuala Lumpur and one in a tiny village of fishermen called Singapore. And then Malaysia became independent, and Singapore seceded to become an independent city-state, and they went their separate states, and the 2 campuses became independent. The one in Singapore became what is known today as National University of Singapore, and the one in KL became the University of Malaya, the flagship university of Malaysia. And so it's very striking to see that even though they started alike, today there is a stark difference if we believe some of the rankings, like the Shanghai ranking, where this year NUS is 85. In fact, last year it broke the 100 barrier ceiling. And University of Malaya, however, is way back somewhere between 301 and 400. So I try to understand what went different in both cases. And to share the results of my research, I've divided my presentation today into 3 parts. First, trying to define what is a world-class university. Then how do you get there? What is the road to academic excellence? And last but not least, coming to the theme of today's conference, how important is internationalization on this road to excellence? And we already heard very good examples of why it matters to send you to have some elements of internationalization as part of an engineering curriculum. So how do you recognize a world-class university? My friend and colleague Phil Altbach once wrote that everybody wants one, but no one knows what is it, and no one knows how to get one. So what do we do about that? Well, perhaps if we want to define a world-class university, the easiest way is to look at the self-declaration. Believe me, if you go to the websites of many universities, you will see that they're all world-class. So here is Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Join the world-class. Cambridge MBA, also world-class. Now, in the case of Cambridge, of course, we cannot doubt them. Isn't Cambridge such a beautiful place? Oscar Wilde once wrote to a friend of his, "How are you enjoying yourself at Cambridge?" Whatever people may say against Cambridge, it is still, in my opinion, the best place in the world to prepare to go to Oxford. Now, another way would be to look at the reputation of universities. I'm sure that if I ask you to write on a piece of paper the names of the top 3 universities, of course, after Mahidol University, we would find pretty much the same names. But is that very scientific? I'm not quite sure. So we must be thankful to the rankers who, for the first time, provided us with a clean, neat way of discerning who is top, who are the world-class universities. In Shanghai, at Jiao Tong University, at the Center for World-Class Universities, little did these 3 innocent-looking young men realize what they were unleashing on the world when they published the first academic ranking of world universities in 2003. How many nightmares they would provoke for university vice presidents, vice chancellors, and rectors all over the world. Now, what does the ranking tell us? Over the years, I've built a small index that measures the number of top 100 universities that a country has relative to its population, and I'm using the log of the population to have a better measure. So no surprise, US comes first. But then I want you to look at this list of countries: Switzerland, Australia, Holland, Sweden, Denmark, Canada. What do they have in common? These are small countries, and yet the number of world-class universities that they have relative to their population is higher than big countries like Germany or France, Japan, or Russia. Now we have two newcomers in the past 2 years, China, and we have one representative of Tsinghua University and Beda, and Singapore. These are newcomers to the top 100. And you may have noticed that I also included two US states, California and Massachusetts, because if they were independent countries, they would be number 2 and number 6 in the world. Again, because of the concentration of world-class universities from which Professor Sakor comes, in the case of Massachusetts. Nature, the scientific review, also established a ranking of what they call the rising stars. These are universities or research centers that are improving much faster than the world average. So these are the top 100, and we see countries that are moving fast: China, US, UK, Germany, India, Switzerland, Australia, Sweden, Canada, France, Italy, Poland, and South Korea. And here in your region, the top 25 for South and Southeast Asia, India dominating, but we're happy to see Singapore and Thailand also. And what I'm sharing with you is the product of a few publications over the past years. I wrote a book called The Challenge of Establishing World-Class University, and then with Phil Altbach, we looked at 11 case studies of very successful universities, and also one failure study. Because in Africa, the Ibadan University in Nigeria used to be the top university, but over the years it has declined. And I believe that we often learn more from failure than success. That cannot always be reproduced. I also wrote a chapter on the impact of excellence initiatives in this book, and this is our most recent. Again, a series of case studies of new universities that have done very well, very fast. Now, I'm not trying to do a marketing exercise now. Most of my publication you can download free of charge from my website. Now, when I try to understand what makes a world-class universities, like those of you scientists and engineers here, I have a very simple mind, and so I had to come up with a simple model. And I started thinking about the results of top universities, which are their graduates, recognized as such not only on the local labor market, but worldwide, leading-edge research, and last but not least, dynamic knowledge and technology transfer. And I realized that to achieve these fantastic results, you needed to combine 3 sets of factors, which are concentration of talent, abundant resources, and favorable governance. And let me explain a little bit, go through it. First of all, a great university has great academics. In Canada, recently there was quite a surprise because McGill was considered as one of the top universities, and all of a sudden McMaster was doing better in the rankings. And people who wanted to understand what's happening there. And they realized that in the past few years, McMaster has aggressively recruited young, top young researchers, and that is what makes these are highly cited researchers, and that's what makes the difference for the ranking. And in fact, I want you to look at these two figures. This is the number of highly cited researchers in one university in one case, and in one country in the other case. Any guess? So the one university is Harvard, and the one country is Canada. Can you imagine that Harvard has had as many highly cited scientists as the whole of Canada? But it's not only about teachers and researchers, it's also the quality of your incoming students. This is a 12-year-old who started university at Princeton last year. He's so bright that doesn't matter that he's not too young. Now, I know many countries, certainly in my country, Morocco, but in many other countries where we would not accept a young student because the rule says that you have to be 18 or 17, right? And then if you're going to be a top research university, the balance between undergraduate students and graduate students has to be right. Here are some statistics showing you the high percentage of graduate students. At MIT, for example, 60%. Beijing, 53%. And here, we see the top two universities in Thailand, Chulalongkorn, close to 30%, and Mahidol, 32%. You have the highest proportion of graduates, but still below what the other universities that I showed have. And remember, it's not only about making a distinction between graduate students doing research and undergraduate learning. In fact, when you go to top research, and I don't know if it's the case at your university, Professor Sacco, but certainly at Stanford and MIT and other universities, undergraduate students get the opportunity to participate in research already in first year. And then the international dimension. World-class universities are international universities with a high proportion of foreign faculty. Look at Polytechnic Zurich in Switzerland, 60% of their professors are foreigners. Or a high proportion of foreign students, close to 20% in the case of Cambridge and Harvard. Second dimension is money. So when the first Shanghai ranking was published in 2003, big European countries like France and Germany were appalled because their top university was nowhere to be found in the top 50. And they said, come on, we're Heidelberg, Sorbonne, this is where the universities come from. And one of the explanations, they realized that their resources were not as high as the competitors. So if we look at the share of government funding for higher education, we see that the US is able to spend 3.3% of GDP compared to 1.1% in Europe. And it's not because government is spending more. Actually, share of government is about equal. But the US, much better than any other country in the world, is able to raise private funding for higher education. And one of the distinctions is the large endowments that top universities have. This is my favorite endowment picture. USC, University of Southern California, it's a private research university in Los Angeles. And they have a football team, college football is very important in US universities, and they are called the Trojans. So this beautiful white horse, Travelers, is their mascot. And just for the horse, they have an endowment of $4 million US. So you can imagine how much more money they have for the entire university. And here are a few numbers. Any guess what these two numbers mean? Well, $450 billion is Thailand's GDP. And $37 billion is Harvard's endowment. So it's about 10% of your GDP. And in fact, there are 113 countries on our planet whose GDP is lower than the endowment of Harvard. Just to imagine the size of the resources that these top universities have. In fact, If we compare US and the UK, these are in 2009 dollars. Look at Harvard and Cambridge. Harvard is almost 5 times as rich as Cambridge. And on a per student basis, we see the richest university is Princeton. They have $1.7 million per student, whereas Cambridge is only $340,000. But it's not only endowment, it's in some cases tuition fees, and perhaps most importantly is research funding. Again, one of the paradoxes in the US is that you have top private universities that are able to attract more public research money than many public universities. And just to give you the example of Stanford with the 2017 budget. So they have 6,000 externally funded research projects representing $1.6 billion. That's equivalent to the entire higher education budget of many countries in the world. And again, Stanford is a private university. 81% of their research funding comes from government. In fact, they host 2 national research centers and a national laboratory and one of the first think tanks. Now, taking advantage that I have a captive audience, I want to tell you about my favorite football team. And now some of you may think that Manchester or Real Madrid or Munich are better teams, but no, Barca, FC Barcelona is the best. You all agree with me? Now let us play a game. Let us imagine that Barca or any of these champion teams would have to operate with the same rules as a public university, which means that their players would be civil servants with civil service remuneration, that they would not be able to attract top players with higher salaries or get rid of players who don't perform. Imagine that before a big championship game, instead of the coach making decisions about the strategy that they're going to follow, they would have to follow instructions from the Ministry of Sports. Do you think they would still be a great champion team? Or might they not become mediocre? And I ask you, what is more important, football or the education of our daughters and sons? That we believe that these rules make sense for a public university. I use this example to call your attention to the third set of factors, governance, which I believe, in fact, is the most important factor. World-class universities need world-class governance. That means freedom from civil service rules and management autonomy. Sadly, in many countries, public universities do not have the power to act independently, and more importantly, perhaps, to act very fast, because we live in a rapidly changing world. So poor universities are faced with lots of regulations and constraints. They are not autonomous in terms of organization, deciding who is on their board, how they select their leader. In many countries, it's still democratic election, changing their structure. Autonomy to manage their human resources, autonomy to manage their money, and last but not least, academic autonomy. A few weeks back, I was giving a speech in Chile, and after my presentation, this young researcher gave a brilliant talk. He explained to us how he had set up the first biomedical neuroscience institute in the whole of Latin America. He's the leader of a research team with researchers from Harvard, from Imperial College. He's the leader, the Chilean guy. And at the end of his impressive talk, he said just one sentence which left us all shocked. He said, everything I have described that we have managed with my colleagues, we did it in spite of our university, because of the whole set of regulations and restrictions that make life very difficult if you want to be innovative, if you want to be bold, if you want to be more flexible. And I believe that in many cases we ask our public universities to compete with the rest of the world, but we put them with this small impediment. Now that I have presented my simple model, let us see whether it helps us understand better what happened in Malaysia and Singapore. So if we think first about concentration of talent. Now, in terms of equity, Malaysia has run the largest affirmative action program in the world, and they've been very successful in bringing in the Malay part of the population. But as a result, selection is not always purely academic. They are restricted in terms of the proportion of foreign students that they can bring in. By contrast, NUS is highly selective. A large proportion of their students come from other countries, including professors and researchers. Second, in terms of money, University of Malaya's main resources is from government. And in fact, it's not a poor university. $14,000 per student, that's what European universities get on average. But NUS, after constituting a $1 billion endowment, is able to spend 3 times as much. And lastly, in terms of governance, the appointment of vice-chancellors in Malaysia is still very political. And as a result, University of Malaya has had a large number of vice-chancellors. Whereas in Singapore, it's more on a professional basis, and they've had many less vice-chancellors. University of Malaya is restricted by the kind of regulations that I have tried to illustrate with my football example. Whereas NUS, even though it is a public university, operates with the flexibility of a private corporation. And you can see that the sad irony is that of some of the top foreign professors that NUS attracts are among the best from Malaysia. Or look at the proportion of researchers. So how do you get there? How do you become a world-class university? On the road to academic excellence, I have identified 3 pathways. First, you can create a new institution. You can provoke mergers or decide to merge with another institution. You can constitute what I call conglomerates. And, which is the most common way, you want to upgrade existing institutions. This is one of my favorite places in the world, All-in College of Engineering, a brand new school of engineering 15 miles south of Boston, created from scratch 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But you have a few more around the world. King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, Skoltech in Moscow, and Nepal is trying to establish a new University of Science and Technology, and India has a whole program of institutes of eminence that want to be world-class. Now, obviously, when you start from scratch, it's much more expensive, so very few countries can afford it. And it's not easy to get the right culture from the beginning. You know, you just don't have a magic wand and say, this new university is going to be world-class. No, you have to work very hard at it, and to create a deep tradition of research takes a long time. And in some countries, there is a challenge of academic freedom, without which proper scientific inquiry cannot take place. Then you have the mergers. Many countries have thought that, you know, because some of the rankings give preference to size, you can climb in the ranking if you have more publications. They say, well, let's merge, and maybe we will go higher in the ranking. So China, Russia, France, Denmark, Finland are some examples of countries that have pushed their universities to merge. And the idea is that you will achieve synergy because the result will be higher than just the contribution of each university. But in a way, a merger is like a marriage. It's not always easy. And as you know better than me, each institution has its own culture. And so when you merge two universities, you often have a clash of cultures. In Russia, for example, the federal universities program was imposed by government. And so they decided on, they told these two universities, you get together. And the main criterion was geographical proximity, not really looking at possible complementarities. And as a result, many of these universities are suffering from a tension between their former regional vocation and the new agenda of international competition. You may remember from the corporate world, when Hewlett-Packard and Compaq merged, it was not a very smooth enterprise. Now, my observation is that what works better than full merger is what I call mini merger, when a university acquires a small part of something different. Let me give you a few examples. So the Polytechnic Lausanne in Switzerland has become, in my view, one of the top, if not the top, engineering school in the Francophone world. And one of the things they did on their way to improving was they realized that they were not very strong. It's an engineering school, but they were not very strong in the basic sciences. So they agreed with the University of Lausanne that the departments of math, physics, and chemistry will be transferred to the engineering school. University of Aarhus in Denmark is the #2 university. A few years back, they absorbed the National Environment Studies Institute, a research institute that helped them strengthen their focus. The third approach is what I call conglomerates. So a few years back, the French government launched an excellence initiative called IDEX programs. And 8 universities have participated. In 3 cases, they did some mergers. University of Strasbourg is one very successful example. But the others have created conglomerates. Why do I use this word? Because they have brought universities and professional schools. The French have these elite grandes écoles and research institutes, and try to bring them together without merging, but still working together. Frankly, I find it's not been very successful because the governance is not clear and they're not really fully integrated. But they hope that having this big mass will get them higher in the ranking. In fact, they have been negotiating with Shanghai, and they're very upset at the Shanghai ranking because they are not recognized as universities, rightly so. Vietnam, not too far from here, is another example. A few years back, the government created 2 national universities. So we have Vietnam National University in Hanoi, Vietnam National University in Ho Chi Minh City, and similarly, you have one umbrella university with several universities within it and research institutes. And again, I find that there is a lack of integration and synergy because each university still operates in an independent way. And the head of the umbrella university does not have much power over the individual members of this conglomerate. And the last approach is the upgrading approach. Of course, it's less costly because you already have your infrastructure, and the challenge is to create a new culture. Again, you cannot just decide by decree. The minister from here would say, university such and such, from now on you're going to become excellent. No, it's hard work. You need to focus on governance to upgrade your university. And I want to make the analogy, since a few years back was the 100th anniversary of the tragedy of the Titanic. And I ask you, What would you think if you were to read reports that on the fateful night when the Titanic sunk or began to sink, if the leadership had left the boat as first, if they had continued to play music and operate as if nothing was happening, and if they had taken care of the crew before the passengers, some of you would think this is criminal. And in fact, this is not what happened. Captain Smith died with the boat, and they tried as hard as possible to save the passengers. But why I use this comparison is, like, sadly, in many universities that I know, it's all about the comfortable life of the academics and less about the needs of the students. It's all about making marginal improvements, but not really rethinking why are we excellent? What do we need to do to achieve a qualitative, to leapfrog? Very often we have cumbersome ways of making decisions, as this cartoon tries to illustrate. Ooh, that was close. We almost made a decision. After 2 years, academics are great at identifying problems. So we find a problem, we set up a group to look at the problem, we spend 6 months deciding who's going to be a member, who's going to chair, and after 2 years, nothing. And country after country, I see a first wave of reform and a second wave, and 10 years later, nothing has changed. Now, it's not always the case. There are a few successful examples of universities that have really transformed themselves. UCLA, after World War II, was not a very famous university, was not a very successful university, but it has transformed itself. Most recently, Arizona State University in Phoenix has really improved a lot. They restructure, reorganize themselves to be by themes, to look at the big challenges of their region. And they've become much more research focused, while at the same time not giving up their characteristic of being a very inclusive university. University of Leeds in the UK. I just mentioned Aarhus University in Denmark and Polytechnic of Lausanne. Now, if you ask me, of the 4 approaches that I described, which one works better? My experience seems to indicate that upgrading and merging are quite complicated for the reasons I mentioned. Setting up these huge conglomerates is messy, to say the least. And relatively, establishing a new university from scratch is a bit easier. It's not easy, but it is, at least you don't have a past that you carry with yourself. So lastly, why is internationalization so important? When we think about world-class university, is it like a good wine that requires many, many years to mature? After all, if we think about the old universities, Harvard is 400 years old. Oxford and Cambridge are almost 1,000 years old. Do we have to wait 1,000 years to have our own world-class universities? The good news is that no, we don't have to wait. It is possible to leapfrog. And that's what a few governments have tried to do. With this so-called excellence initiative, as in France, as in Germany, Brain Korea, in South Korea, in Russia, the 5-100 program, when President Putin was re-elected a few years back, in his first speech, he complained, why don't we have a top Russian? Why don't we have any Russian university in the top 100? Thailand, a few years back, had its own excellence initiative, which consists in a large injection of additional public funding to promote a few existing universities in an accelerated fashion. In most cases, there is a competition, as in the case of in Germany or in France or in Korea. In some cases, I believe that was the case in Thailand, governments identified 9 universities that would receive additional funding. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, governments will promote the creation of new universities. Now, I have identified what I called accelerating factors, factors that need to be taken into consideration if you want to improve a university very fast. And the first, perhaps most important one, I would say, is leadership. It takes a leader who can inspire the entire academic community, who can, working with the community, develop a new vision. And duration is also very important. A few months back, I visited a university, a public university in Mexico. And there, the mandate of the rector, the university president, is only 4 years. And you cannot have a second mandate. So they showed me this nice building where they said they had 20 former rectors. It takes more than 4 years to transform a university. And so duration of the appointment of a leader is an important factor. Academics and researchers, mid-career, but also young, promising researchers, pushing for the return of your diaspora. China has the Sea Turtles program, for example. Relying on foreign students coming as master and doctoral students, which means that you need to teach and do research in English. Whether we like it or not, English is a scientific language today. Maybe tomorrow Chinese, we will all be learning Chinese. But for today, those institutions that can operate in English have an advantage. I like this poster that you see in the airports, that there are 5 times more people learning English in China than there are people in England. I'm always struck when I go to a conference in China, because usually the university will assign a young graduate student to show me around, and I talk to these young ladies or young boys who have a much better English accent than mine, and I ask them, how long where did you go to the US, UK, Canada, Australia? They say, oh, I've never left China. But they know that learning English is important. Big scandal in Italy, because the leader of the Polytechnic University in Milan, the top engineering school in Italy, decided that all graduate programs will be taught only in English. Many professors were upset. What about the glorious Italian language? They took the university to court to try to prevent this from happening. But the court decided that since it was only at graduate level, that was fine. A few years back, I did some work in Cyprus, small island. They have only one public university, very young, 20 years. And I was so impressed to realize that on a per capita basis, they were the most successful country in terms of attracting European Commission grants, the ERC program. And when I went there, I understood why. Because when they started the university, they went to Australia, UK, Canada, US, etc., and they recruited researchers, experienced researchers of Cypriot origin to come, and these people already knew how to do grants. In fact, some of them carried their grants with themselves. A good way of developing very rapidly. Increasingly, co-publications are important for, research teams are not one person, you have big teams. And this slide shows you in blue, these are publications that are only with people from the same country. Red are publications with international co-publishers. And we see that the number of international collaborations is growing much faster, at least in the UK and in the US. Third factor, being a niche institution or offering niche programs. No. It's much easier if you want to, you cannot grow, improve, and become excellent in all areas. In fact, even Harvard, #1 university in the world, is not excellent in all its programs or disciplines. And you have more focused institutions like MIT, like Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, or Moscow School of Economics, like LSE in the UK. And I think that's one of the strengths of Mahidol University, to be very strong in health sciences. Fourth accelerating factor, curriculum, pedagogical and managerial innovations. When Hong Kong University of Science and Technology starts 25 years ago, you already have very good universities on the territory, starting with University of Hong Kong. So one of the attractions was to establish the first US-style curriculum compared to the traditional British-style curriculum in Hong Kong. And last but not least, something that may sound boring, strategic planning and benchmarking. It's hard work to try to understand where are you weak, where do you want to invest. Jiao Tong University in Shanghai has improved a lot because they were very good at systematically doing benchmarking and planning for a better future. In conclusion, by the end of this year, I will have flown 165 times, which is much better than last year, where I flew 185 times. And I tell you, when I am up there, sitting in the airplane, I like to know that everything is working well. And as you know, airplanes are complex machinery. And I wouldn't be so happy if the pilot would come on the mic and say, well, folks, good news is that we have good control pitch and we have wings are fine, and one of the engines is fine, but the other is not that fine, and actually the rudder is not working well. No, you want everything to work well at the same time, right? It's the same thing about universities. Remember my circle. You cannot have just talent or just good governance or just money. You need all three together. If the factors of success are aligned, you will be very, very good. You will be the best. But if they are not, you might have some trouble at the end of the road. So a few words of caution. First of all, don't get obsessed with the international rankings. Rankings can give you, it's like a thermometer. If you have a fever, you know that you have a fever. Does it tell you what's wrong with you? Not at all. Beware of imitating. Aha, the ranking tells me Harvard is #1, I'm going to become like Harvard. No, Harvard is unique. You don't want to all look alike. You don't want to try to fit where you don't fit. Oscar Wilde once said, don't try to be like the others. Be yourself. Everybody else is already taken. Dare to be different, which was an important message from our first speaker. Build synergies across institutions and disciplines. Break away from the structures and the procedures of the past. Provide an enabling environment for creativity, for innovation, for genuine institutional autonomy, and try to achieve critical mass in a few niche areas of excellence. On the road to academic excellence, you need to constantly challenge yourself. Remember Nokia. One day they were #1, the next day they were almost on their way out. You need to keep investing, innovating. You need to have a sense of urgency. And in fact, that's something I notice more in this part of the world compared with other parts of the world where I also work in Latin America or Africa. A friend of mine became the rector of Aarhus University, and his challenge was to transform the university, even though the university was doing very well. And that's how he expressed it. His strategic plan was called Making a Strong University Stronger, Change Without a Burning Platform. Olin College of Engineering that I mentioned earlier has this expiry principle. They are constantly redoing their curriculum, looking at their status. What can be changed? What can be improved? Then you will change it. I worked with the University of South Pacific in Fiji, and the title of the new strategic plan was Good is Not Good Enough. Or as the UK University Alliance says, if we will stand still, we will fall behind. So my parting gift to you, before we go for lunch, the world-class university recipe. Lots of talent, plenty of resources, a touch of governance, but perhaps most importantly, allowed to simmer for a long time. Daniel Lincoln says something which I think captures it well. He said, excellence, like all things of abiding value, is a marathon, not a sprint to the rankings. Any question, comment?
Thank you for a very prescient and suggestive presentation. Tony Welch, University of Sydney. I wonder, one of the things you have not talked about so much is a feature of many systems of higher education worldwide, and that is the increasing pressure for accountability, which in one sense is perfectly understandable because we all consume public resources. At another level, however, it's often argued that the pressure on accountability is in fact almost like a form of accountancy. We're spending more and more of our time responding to ever more intricate forms of regulation and surveillance, both at the institutional level and the national level, and many people argue that detracting from our capacity to do what we are there to do, teaching and research. I wonder whether you'd care to comment.
No, I fully agree with you, and I've seen it in Australia, I've seen it in Canada, I see it in many parts of the world where the government as a whole is asking for a lot of accountability, sometimes even Parliament. In Quebec, for example, in Canada, university rectors or vice chancellors have to go to Parliament every year to account for their achievements. And then you have, it's not only one government agency, very often you have several government agencies, so you have the Ministry of Education or Commission of Higher Education, and then you have the Quality Assurance Agency, and then you have the financial audits, etc. And universities spend more time explaining what they are doing, justifying the use of resources than doing what they're supposed to do. So I agree with you that while accountability is very important because one of the still it has to be light touch and make sense. Now the truth is that some universities, because of this world-class focus, do not always take into consideration aspects that are still very important. You know, in the UK, for example, the top universities are still very elitist. And the proportion of first-generation students or students from minority or low-income students is still very low. So there is progress to be done. Also, in a world of, in a so-called post-truth world, universities have a very important social responsibility to promote science, to promote democratic debate, etc. And accountability is important for that. But it should not be, it's rather light touch than exaggerated reporting. Yes, please.
Thank you for that wonderful recipe for creating world-class universities. As you yourself mentioned, India is embarking on doing so. What I am to understand from your presentation is that creating a world-class university is a very, very costly affair. And therefore, getting these kind of financial resources is going to be a big challenge for India. So in your mind, how realistic is this plan of India to create so many world-class universities in one go?
Please don't quote me officially, but I think that it is highly unrealistic. And it's not only the money. I think that India's institutions have, I mean, if you compare progress in India and progress in China over the past 20 years, there is a huge gap, growing gap. I mean, China has developed much faster. And in the case of India, I think that the way
greatest schools of engineering in the world today, they will never be in the Shanghai ranking because it's an undergraduate college by vocation. You know, it's not a research university. I believe much more in benchmarking. You know, the rankings, you have people in Shanghai or in London imposing on you the criteria by which you are going to be judged, which do not always make sense. It's much better to do benchmarking because you choose the indicators that make sense for you, and you choose with whom you want to compare yourself. And sometimes you can do it as a partnership. University of Auckland British university, and they do benchmarking together. Also, rankings push this idea of competition. I do believe that in higher education, what is more important is collaboration. And in fact, even if you want to compete, you will be stronger to compete if you have partners, if you learn together, if you do research together, if you exchange your students or your professors. Now, I agree with you, subject ranking makes more sense than having this one number that describes the entire university. But use this as a benchmarking tool, not as something that will drive your entire planning and activity. I'm shocked when I visit Australian universities and I see that some of them have a ranking officer. And not only in Australia, a person that is
calculating all the time and giving advice to the vice chancellor or to the president on what to do, what not to do, so that you can rise in the rankings. So I once was invited at the French Senate for a session on the rankings, and the session was called Forget Shanghai. And I think that's not a bad title.
Yeah, Georg Verein from German Academic Exchange Service. Just one remark on the rankings. There is a European project that might be interesting, which is the multi-rank system, multi-rank, I think, where you can set your own priorities yourself, and where you can also do ranking by subject. Unfortunately, it has not been adopted very well by many German universities, so I would love to tell just a success story, but, well, it's kind of a mixed message. So many universities seem to be very keen on those big rankings, although obviously it doesn't really help if your university is doing extremely well in medical research and you find out, yeah, it's ranked number 89 worldwide, and now I'm studying, well, a bachelor's in economics there, and well, I don't benefit from all that medical research and all the publications and the worldwide reputation, and find out that actually the economic undergraduate school is pretty weak. Yeah, what do you think of that multi-rank approach? Because that seems very promising from at least a student perspective.
Thank you for a good question. If you allow me, you reminded me, I didn't answer part of the question about multidisciplinary. The journals where we've published are mostly unidisciplinary. And if you do interdisciplinary, if you do frontier work, you will not necessarily publish in a journal that reflects that. So that's another problem of the ranking, that there is a bias against multidisciplinary research. Now, I agree with you that, even though the origin of multi-rank is a bit shaky. I remember when it was announced, the French Minister of Higher Education said, we, the Europeans, we're going to have our own ranking where our university will be better ranked than in Shanghai. But the principle, the way multi-rank is designed, is much better. It's more of a benchmarking tool than a ranking, and it's being taken. I was working with a Chilean university last week, and they were members of the multi-rank, and they found it very useful in terms of benchmarking. And in fact, it's ironic, in Germany, the most famous ranking, the CHE ranking, is not a ranking. It's really a benchmarking tool where you can choose which indicator you want to use, which weight you give to the, so each person, whether you're a student, a university person, or an employer, can construct his or her own version of the ranking. But yes, I think multi-rank is more promising from that point of view. No more comments, questions? Everybody's so hungry, and I stand between you and the meal.
Any more questions? We still have about 10 minutes left. All right, so perhaps not. Okay, one more please. Darren?
Thank you very much, Doctor. It was a fascinating presentation, as always. Leading into the next session, which is a little bit more focused on the future of internationalization, I'd be interested in your views on that. We all know prediction is difficult, especially about the future, as Niels Bohr said. Are we heading for an era where internationalization is coming more to the fore, or is diminishing? Is higher education entering a utopian period, or is it somewhat more pessimistic and dystopian?
I'm an optimistic. And I think that whatever is happening with all the bad governance that we see in many countries, with the nationalistic approaches, with the looking inward, I think that young people don't care about that. The young people, they want to be international. They want to visit other countries, to go to other universities. So they will be driving internationalization in a way, and that's why I'm still optimistic. And also, I think we're going to see a new version increasingly of digital internationalization. I mean, the MOOCs are one form. You have research platforms, and then you have many, many different platforms. I'm struck, you may have read a few years back, this math student from Russia, somewhere in Russia, who participated in competition that MIT has set up, and thanks to that, he was invited to join MIT with a full scholarship. I think that, and of course some countries try to control the internet, but as long as we have access to the internet, we have many, many forms of collaboration and internationalization that will just grow exponentially. So that's why I'm still optimistic. Yes, please.
Well, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Just a very quick question, because you mentioned the French case several times as something that was not very successful in the race for becoming a world-class universities. What would be your advice for the French government, following all these excellence initiatives and the mergers and so on?
Well, I've been an advisor to the French government for the past 3 years. I'm a member of the international jury for the Excellence Initiative, and what I see is that a reluctance to do away with some structures of the past that are not really conducive. For example, you have division between these grandes écoles and universities. So in the French system, the top high school graduates will go to these competitive elite professional schools and not to university. At universities, 50% of the students will fail. So it's only at the graduate level that you will have the better students. So you have this distinction in terms of the students. Then you have distinction because you have a national research organization called CNRS. Mind you, in Germany, to some extent, we also have this distinction. You see it in Russia. In the Anglo-Saxon model, you don't have this separation between research and teaching. They are all together. And I think that's one of the challenges that France faces. The other challenge is governance. So you have this democratic way of electing university leaders. And my experience, not only in France, but I've seen it in Italy, Spain, or the whole of Latin America, is that when you have a democratic election, it's like a political election, you don't always get the best leader. Because it's much easier to promise your academic constituency that you will not change much than to say, you know what, life is not going to be as it used to be, you're going to have to be more productive, you're going to be evaluated, those who don't produce will get punished, those who are more productive will be recognized. These are, you have civil service institutions where it doesn't matter whether you're productive or not productive. So these are some of the challenges that France or Spain or Greece are facing.
Okay, so once again, a big round of applause to Dr. Jamil Salmi. Actually, thank you very much for your eye-opening message, and then definitely for your world-class university recipe, all right? Okay, so, well, ladies and gentlemen, I could see from your facial expression that you are all hungry. And then your eyes are also telling me that stop talking, it's lunchtime, all right? So, just a few words about housekeeping announcement, right? To manage the flow of our lunchtime, because we have about 250 participants joining us today. So please take a look at your badge, and then you will see the color toward the end over here. The color will tell you about your luncheon venue. The green one, the green color, is for Bola Restaurant located on the second floor. The green one is for Bola Restaurant located on the second floor. Right, okay. And then the orange color is for Belka Restaurant located on the 32nd floor. 32nd floor, the orange one, the orange color. And then for keynote speakers and speakers, you are all invited to Salon 2, just located on this